There's a specific moment I keep coming back to when I think about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Not from any of the big set pieces, not from the snap, not from the portal scene in Endgame, not from the helicarrier sequence in Winter Soldier. It's actually from a post-credits scene, and it's the quietest one Marvel ever made. After the Battle of New York in the original Avengers, Tony Stark mentions shawarma. He's apparently never tried it. And in the middle of the wreckage of a battle that nearly ended the world, he suggests that maybe they should all go get some. The post-credits scene is just the 6 of them. Iron Man, Cap, Thor, Hulk, Black Widow, Hawkeye, sitting around a table in a wrecked shawarma restaurant, still in their costumes, completely silent, eating. Thor is gently trying to figure out the pita bread. Nobody says anything. Nobody makes a joke. It's just 6 people who have just saved the world, sitting in exhausted silence, eating. And it made the whole theatre laugh. Not because it was a punchline, exactly. It made people laugh because everyone in that room had spent 4 years and 5 separate films watching these characters exist in their own corners of the universe. And suddenly there they were at the same table, just being quietly human together. There was something funny about it, in the most generous possible sense, the relief of it, the ordinariness of it, after everything that had just happened. It was the best kind of payoff, the kind you didn't know you were waiting for until it arrived. That's what the MCU was at its best. A very patient machine for earning moments like that. And somewhere between 2019 and now, something changed. Not dramatically, not with any single announcement you could point to. It was more gradual than that. A slow cooling rather than an explosion. There was a movie you told yourself you'd get to and quietly never did. A Disney Plus show you started while doing the dishes and then left running in the background and never really finished. A theatrical release you eventually caught on a long-haul flight, thought was perfectly fine, and then couldn't recall the villain's name by the time you landed. The MC you had drifted from something you actively anticipated to something that was just kind of there. The numbers eventually started reflecting that in ways that were hard to ignore. Phase 5, which wrapped up in 2025, became the lowest grossing chapter in the franchise's history, earning less globally than Phase 1 did. Back when Marvel was working with characters most mainstream audiences had genuinely never heard of. The Marvels, a sequel to a film that had cleared $1 billion, made just over $200 million worldwide. That's not a speed bump. That's a franchise telling you something real about what happened. So what actually happened? That's the question worth spending the night on, because the easy answer, superhero fatigue, audiences are just done with the genre, doesn't quite hold. James Gunn's Superman film landed quite well in 2025. People showed up for it the way they used to show up for Marvel. The genre still works when it's done right. What happened to the MCU was something more specific, more internal, and in some ways more interesting than simple category exhaustion. There's a fairly complete story here if you want to follow it from the beginning. A story about how you build something extraordinary over a decade, what the conditions are that make that kind of thing possible, and then what happens when those conditions disappear. Replaced by different pressures, different priorities, a machine that had grown very large and needed feeding at a pace the original approach couldn't sustain. It's also, honestly, a story that's still being written. Avengers. Doomsday hasn't come out yet as I'm putting this together. The reset is still ahead of us. We're somewhere in the middle of whatever this chapter is, which makes it an interesting time to sit down and talk through the whole arc properly. What I want to do tonight is just walk through it. How they built it in the first place. What made the early years work so well. The moment the finish line arrived and what it left behind. The decisions that cracked things. The disasters, some of them fascinating and some just genuinely painful. And where the franchise is trying to go from here. It's not a takedown. I genuinely think the Infinity Saga is one of the most impressive, creative achievements in the history of blockbuster cinema, and I don't think that's an overstatement. What makes the decline interesting is precisely because of what was lost. If the MCU had always been mediocre, there'd be nothing worth talking about. Get comfortable. This is a long one. That's kind of the whole point. If you feel like subscribing before we get going, that's always appreciated. It genuinely helps the channel more than it might seem. No pressure, just leaving that there. Alright, let's start at the beginning. To understand what went wrong, you have to first understand how improbable the whole thing was in the first place. In the mid-2000s, Marvel Entertainment was not in a great position. The company had sold off the film rights to its most recognizable characters years earlier when it was going through financial difficulties. X-Men and the Fantastic Four went to Fox. Spider-Man went to Sony. What was left for Marvel to use in its own films were, frankly, the second tier. Iron Man, Thor, Captain America. Characters that general audiences either hadn't heard of or hadn't thought about since Saturday morning cartoons in the 1980s. The idea of turning those characters into a film franchise, and specifically the idea of making a series of interconnected films that would all build toward one massive crossover event, that was not considered a sensible plan at the time. Not by Hollywood studios, not by the trades, and honestly, not even by a lot of Marvel fans who thought the best case scenario was probably one decent Iron Man film, and maybe a sequel if they were lucky. Iron Man opened in May of 2008. It was made on a budget of around $140 million, substantial, but not the kind of money studios typically invested in a character who had never headlined a major film before. Robert Downey Jr. was not the obvious choice for a franchise-launching lead at that particular moment in his career. He was a character actor with a very specific kind of charm, a complicated personal history, and an approach to performance that leaned into intelligence and wit rather than conventional action hero gravitas. He was, in retrospect, exactly the right choice, but nobody was certain of that at the time. The film worked, and the reason it worked is worth understanding, because it's the same reason everything that followed worked for the next 11 years, and the same reason the wheels eventually came off when that reason stopped being the priority. Iron Man worked because it was a complete film first and a franchise starter second. Tony Stark's arc, the weapons manufacturer who becomes the man inside the suit, who looks at his own legacy and decides to build something else, was a satisfying story on its own terms. You didn't need to know anything about the Avengers or S.H.I.E.L.D. or the larger Marvel mythology to find it emotionally coherent. The shared universe breadcrumbs were there for the people looking for them. Nick Fury showing up in the post-credits scene to mention the Avengers initiative felt like a reward for paying attention, not a prerequisite for understanding the film you'd just watched. Kevin Feige held onto that philosophy very deliberately across the next 11 years, and it's the thing that I think gets under-acknowledged when people talk about why the MCU succeeded. The discipline of it. Every film had to work as a film. The continuity was a bonus, not a crutch. The Incredible Hulk came out the same summer as Iron Man. Thor was a Shakespearean family drama about exile and arrogance, set partly in a glittering alien realm and partly in a small New Mexico town, which sounds bizarre but actually worked. Captain America. The first Avenger was a World War II period film that leaned into a very specific kind of old-fashioned heroism. Steve Rogers as a character defined by goodness rather than cleverness, which is much harder to pull off than it sounds. Each of these films had its own tonal identity. Each told its own complete story. The connections between them were layered in carefully rather than plastered on. The Avengers in 2012 was the moment the experiment was publicly proven to have worked. Bringing together 6 characters from 5 separate films and making a movie that was genuinely entertaining on its own terms, that had never been attempted at that scale in blockbuster cinema. The conventional wisdom said it couldn't work. Too many moving parts, too many established characters competing for screen time, too much connective tissue required for anyone who hadn't done the homework. Joss Whedon made it work anyway, largely because he understood that the film's real engine wasn't the alien invasion or the Tesseract. It was the dynamic of 6 very different people in a box, arguing about who they were and what they owed each other. The spectacle was the packaging. The character work was the gift inside. And then the shawarma scene, which I've already talked about, but which captures something essential about the tonal intelligence of those early films. The ability to find the quiet human moment inside the noise, the patience to let the audience breathe. Phase 2 expanded the universe without losing the thread that made it interesting. The Winter Soldier was, and I'll die on this hill, one of the best political action thrillers of the decade, superhero classification or otherwise. It's a film about institutional corruption and the price of blind loyalty that happens to feature a man in a star-spangled suit. Guardians of the Galaxy introduced a talking raccoon and a sentient tree as 2 of the franchise's most beloved characters, and somehow made that work entirely because James Gunn grounded the whole absurd premise in a very specific emotional truth about loneliness and found family. Ant-Man was a heist comedy. The tonal range across these films was remarkable in a real way. The universe was flexible enough to contain all of them without any single entry feeling like it was in the wrong franchise. Phase 3 is where the ambition became truly staggering. Civil War split the team and made audiences genuinely unsure whose side they were on, which is a difficult thing to pull off. Doctor Strange expanded the visual vocabulary of what a Marvel film could look like. Those folding city sequences felt like something new at the time, and they still do. Homecoming gave Spider-Man back to audiences in a way that felt fresh after 2 previous franchise attempts. Black Panther was a cultural moment in the fullest sense. The first Marvel film where the conversation happening outside the theatre was as significant as the film itself. Ragnarok basically reinvented the Thor character from scratch, rescued a series that had started to feel somewhat aimless, and did it through a very specific kind of absurdist energy that had no business working in a franchise this large, and managed to work beautifully anyway. And then Infinity War arrived, which is its own conversation. But the opening 10 minutes alone, Thanos aboard the Asgardian ship, Thor's helplessness, Loki's death, Heimdall using his last act to send Bruce Banner to Earth, communicated almost immediately that this was a Marvel film operating at a different level. The heroes lost, 1 character died and stayed dead. The snap wiped out half of all life in the universe, and Marvel had the audacity to end the film there and make audiences sit with that for a full year. The thing about the Infinity Saga that's worth naming clearly is that it worked because it treated continuity as a reward rather than a requirement. The early phases were designed to be accessible. You could walk into any of those films cold and follow the story. But if you had watched all of them, Infinity War landed differently. Peter Parker's "I don't want to go" meant something more specific if you'd followed him since Homecoming. Tony's grief hit differently if you'd watched his arc across 10 films and understood exactly what he had built and what he stood to lose. The decade of setup created an emotional depth that no single film could have manufactured on its own. That's what 11 years and 23 films actually built. Not just a shared universe in the logistical sense, but an emotional architecture. A system in which caring about characters across a long span of time was itself the mechanism that made the climax work. It was unprecedented, and it worked right up until the point when its own success created conditions that it couldn't survive. But before we get into the decline, let me stay with the golden age a little longer, because there are details about how Marvel operated during those years that are worth understanding, both because they explain the success and because they explain what was lost. Feige's oversight during the Infinity Saga was, by all accounts, extraordinarily hands-on. He was involved in casting, in script development, in tonal decisions, in the connective tissue between individual films. He was the person who held the map of of where the whole saga was going, which meant that individual directors could make their specific film without worrying about whether it fit the larger picture. That was Feige's job. The Russo brothers could make a political thriller. Waititi could make a comedy. Gunn could make his weird space opera. Each of them had a specific creative vision and the freedom to execute it, and Feige's oversight ensured the individual pieces still assembled into a coherent whole. That oversight is worth understanding because it's the thing that made the franchise's tonal diversity a strength rather than a liability. The variety of the Infinity Saga, the way each film had a distinct genre identity, was not the result of each director simply doing whatever they wanted. It was the result of directors doing what they wanted within a framework that kept everything connected. The freedom was real, and so was the structure holding it. There's also something worth saying about the casting decisions of the early phases because the MCU's casting track record during the Infinity Saga was remarkable. Not just Downey as Tony Stark, which was the defining decision, but the whole ensemble. Chris Hemsworth bringing a physical comedy and genuine warmth to a character who could easily have been a bore. Chadwick Boseman in Black Panther, a performance so quietly powerful that watching the film now, knowing what he was going through while he made it, carries a weight beyond anything the filmmakers intended. Tom Holland finding the specific anxious teenage energy that made Peter Parker feel genuinely young rather than just young-looking. Cate Blanchett as Hela in Ragnarok, playing the goddess of death with a bored aristocratic cruelty that was hilarious and terrifying in roughly equal measure. Good casting doesn't make a bad script good, but it makes a good script extraordinary. And the Infinity Saga had both, more consistently than you'd expect across 22 films made by dozens of different filmmakers over 11 years. There's one more thing about the Golden Age that's worth naming explicitly, which is the post-credits scene culture. Marvel turned the post-credits scene into its own art form, a way of threading the needle between satisfying individual films and maintaining anticipation for what was coming next. The original Avengers teaser after the credits of Thor, the first appearance of Thanos' smile at the end of the Avengers, the moment at the end of Ant-Man when the Sokovia Accords are mentioned and you realise the franchise is about to collide with itself again. These weren't just marketing. They were a way of rewarding people who stayed in their seats, of saying to the audience, there's more and you're going to want to know. It was clever without being cynical, and it was one of the mechanisms that kept the participatory culture of the MCU alive between releases. Which is where things start getting interesting. Avengers. Endgame came out in April of 2019 and made roughly $2.8 billion at the global box office. For a while, it was the highest grossing film ever made. It remains one of the most watched films in the history of cinema. These are facts that get cited so often they've started to lose their meaning. So let me try to put the number in a different context. The entire Phase 1 budget, all 6 films from Iron Man to The Avengers, was roughly equivalent to what Endgame made in its opening weekend. That's how far the franchise had travelled in 11 years. And the film was, by almost any measure, a truly satisfying ending. Tony Stark sacrificed himself to save the universe. Steve Rogers lived his life, all the way to the end, and came back old and peaceful. Natasha Romanoff died so that the people she loved could live. The Avengers won. The story was finished, the snap was undone, and the people came back. There was dancing at the end. Something about it really did feel like a conclusion, which is where the first interesting problem appears. Endgame worked as an ending partly because it felt like an ending. The emotional weight of Tony's final "I am Iron Man" worked because it was genuinely final. Steve's retirement worked because it was properly earned, a man who had never stopped fighting getting to live his life in peace. The film gave audiences catharsis precisely because it committed to its conclusions. It didn't hedge. Characters died and stayed dead. A chapter closed, and then the next chapter had to begin. 3 of the 6 original Avengers were gone. Tony Stark, dead. Natasha Romanoff, dead. Steve Rogers, retired and over 100 years old, on a bench by a lake somewhere. The characters the audience had spent 11 years with, the ones who had carried the emotional weight of the entire Infinity Saga, had mostly exited. And Marvel now had to continue the franchise without them. This is a real creative challenge, storytelling challenge, and it's worth treating it seriously, rather than just writing it off as a consequence of poor planning. The challenge isn't unique to Marvel. Any long-form narrative that earns the kind of investment the Infinity Saga earned faces the same problem when it ends. What do you do with an audience that loved the specific people in the story now that those people are gone? You can't fake 11 years of accumulated attachment. You can introduce wonderful new characters, and Marvel did. But the bond between an audience and a fictional person is built through time and through accumulated experience, and you can't shortcut it. There's a comparison that might land better as you're drifting off to sleep than as an argument in a comment section, but I find it genuinely useful. Think about a long book series you loved, something where you spent years with the same set of characters, book after book, watching them change. Now imagine that series reached its climactic final volume and brought everything to a satisfying conclusion. And then the publisher announced that the series would continue with most of the main characters replaced by new ones who had been introduced in the later books. The world is the same, the mythology is the same, but the specific people you fell in love with over 10 years are mostly gone. That's approximately the situation Marvel found itself in after Endgame. What made it harder was the scale of what had just happened. Endgame didn't just end the story, it set a standard. It was the culmination of a specific creative strategy, and replicating that strategy requires the same ingredients. A decade of consistent character development, films that work individually but gain resonance in combination, an audience that has stayed invested across the entire run. Marvel couldn't produce that in 2 years or 3 years. Building a new Infinity Saga, bringing new characters to the level of emotional resonance that Tony and Steve and Natasha had achieved, was a 10-year project. Disney wanted content in 2 years, or less. Kevin Feige acknowledged this much later in a 2025 interview, when he reflected on what went wrong in the post-Endgame period. He noted that between 2007 and 2019, Marvel produced around 50 hours of story. In roughly half that time afterward, the studio produced more than 100 hours. His assessment of that imbalance was direct. That's too much. He said it plainly, which is unusual enough in corporate Hollywood to be worth noting. Marvel's own staff had a name for what was already forming. They called it the No New Fans Club. The implication being that the franchise had gotten so self-referential, so layered with its own mythology, that new audiences couldn't easily enter. That problem was real before Disney Plus launched. What Disney Plus did was make it dramatically worse, all of which brings us to the decision that made every one of these problems significantly worse. But before that, one more dimension of the Endgame paradox that I find actually interesting. Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. Chadwick Boseman died in August of 2020. He had been playing T'Challa since Captain America. Civil War and his Black Panther had been one of the Infinity Saga's genuine achievements. A character with a philosophical complexity and a regal self-possession that felt different from every other character in the franchise. He died at 43, having made Black Panther Infinity War and Endgame while privately battling colon cancer for 4 years. Nobody at Marvel knew, most of his co-workers didn't know. Wakanda Forever was the franchise's attempt to process that loss, and director Ryan Coogler made something deeply moving, a film about grief and succession and the weight of legacy that functioned both as a story about Wakanda and as a public memorial for the man who had made Wakanda feel real. The film asked a version of the same question the entire post-Endgame MCU was asking: how do you continue when the person you built everything around is no longer there? Wakanda. Forever's answer, imperfect and painful as it was was to let the grief be visible and to let the story acknowledge what had been lost rather than trying to replace it immediately. The critical and audience reception was warm. Wakandu forever worked, but it also illustrated the weight of what the franchise was trying to carry in the post-Endgame period, a weight that went beyond production challenges and box office strategy into something more specifically human. The franchise had lost characters to story decisions and actors to retirement and, in one devastating case, to actual death. And it had to keep going, keep telling stories, keep asking audiences to invest in what was next, while the grief of what was gone was still sitting on the surface. That context doesn't excuse the specific failures of Phase 4 and 5, but it does make the period feel less like simple corporate mismanagement and more like a franchise navigating a truly difficult transition under unusually complicated circumstances, which is, I think, closer to the truth. And there's something Wakanda Forever did that the franchise could have learnt from more broadly. It succeeded in the post-Endgame era because it was honest about grief, rather than trying to sidestep it. It didn't try to replace T'Challa immediately, or manufacture a new character to fill the same emotional space. It let the loss be visible, let the story be shaped by absence, and trusted that audiences could find meaning in that honesty. The film was explicitly about what it's like when something you built is gone, and you have to figure out what comes next, which is almost perfectly metaphorical for the MCU's larger situation. The franchise could perhaps have applied that lesson more broadly, rather than rushing to replace the departed characters with new ones at scale, maintaining the same volume of releases, continuing to operate as if Endgame hadn't fundamentally changed the conditions. A more honest reckoning with the loss might have produced a slower, more considered transition. But the institutional pressure to maintain output didn't allow for that, and so the post-Endgame MCU ended up in the awkward position of grieving its golden age while simultaneously being required to outrun the grief, all of which brings us to the decision that made every one of these problems significantly worse. Disney Plus launched in November of 2019, a few months after Endgame. Disney had invested an enormous amount of money and infrastructure into building a streaming platform, and it needed a reason for people to subscribe and stay subscribed. The Marvel Cinematic Universe was the most reliable creative brand in Disney's portfolio. It was the obvious choice to be the primary content engine for the new service. The mandate that came down to Marvel Studios was to produce a consistent, ongoing stream of not just films but streaming series, and to make them interconnected with the films in ways that gave subscribers reasons to watch both. The logic was coherent from a business standpoint. If watching a Disney Plus show was necessary for understanding the next theatrical film, audiences would subscribe to Disney Plus. If watching the theatrical film made the Disney Plus show more rewarding, audiences would keep their subscription. Content generates subscriptions, subscriptions generate revenue, and the whole machine keeps running. What this created in practice was a production pace that Marvel's creative infrastructure was not built to sustain. In 2022 alone, a single calendar year, Marvel released 3 theatrical films, 3 Disney Plus shows, and 2 streaming specials. That's 8 separate pieces of content across 12 months. By contrast, in the entirety of Phase 1, the entire run from Iron Man to the Avengers, Marvel had produced 6 films over roughly 4 years. The difference in pace isn't just quantitative, it changes the conditions under which creative decisions get made. Feige's own account of what this did to the creative process is illuminating. In various interviews around 2024 and 2025, he described his team as genuinely overwhelmed. He acknowledged that for the first time in the franchise's history, the demand for output exceeded the studio's capacity to maintain the quality standards it had held during the Infinity Saga. Staff members reportedly pursued him in hallways looking for creative notes on projects that were already deep in production. Some teams were sent into production without scripts that had gone through the development process that had protected the earlier phases. Changes were requested too late to implement without damage to the finished product. The visual effects pipeline broke down in ways that became publicly visible. Marvel's VFX vendors had been stretched before, but the pace of post-Endgame production pushed things past what the industry could absorb. At the world premiere of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania in February of 2023, industry figures in the audience were openly noting unfinished effects, sequences that appeared out of focus, compositing that felt rushed, backgrounds that didn't match the production quality audiences expected from a major Marvel release. One veteran power broker was quoted as saying they had never seen anything like it. That's not a small creative error. That's a symptom of a system running too fast for its own quality controls. The VFX workers themselves had been speaking up about conditions for some time. Allegations of extended crunch periods, inadequate timelines, and last-minute changes that required entire sequences to be rebuilt emerged from multiple sources and multiple vendors. The pace wasn't just affecting the finished product, it was affecting the people doing the work. And then there was the interconnectedness problem, which was the strategic backfire that probably did the most long-term damage to the audience relationship. The plan was to make the films and the Disney Plus shows mutually essential. Watch both, get the full picture. What happened in practice was that the threshold for engagement rose faster than the audience was willing to follow. To fully follow the MCU by 2022 meant watching the WandaVision show to understand Wanda's arc in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. It meant watching The Falcon and the Winter Soldier to understand Sam Wilson's journey before he appeared in Brave New World. It meant watching Loki to understand the Kang villain setup that would supposedly pay off across the next several years. It meant watching Ms. Marvel to understand the character dynamic in the Marvels. None of those individual requirements is unreasonable on its own, but stacked together, they created a situation where staying current with the MCU was a genuine time commitment, and missing any piece left you feeling like you'd arrived late to a conversation that had been going on without you. That feeling is not the feeling that generates enthusiasm, it's the feeling that makes people stop trying. Feige's description of the core problem, when he eventually articulated it, was probably the most succinct summary of what went wrong. He said the expansion led people to say, "It used to be fun, but now do I have to know everything about all of these?" That's the exact moment, not a box office number or a critic's review, but a viewer asking themselves whether they have to do homework before the next movie, where casual fans start making a different choice. The irony of the whole strategy is that it achieved its short-term goals. Disney Plus subscriber numbers were strong in the early years after launch, partly because of Marvel content. But the cost of those short-term gains was the gradual erosion of the cultural participation that had made the MCU something people talked about and looked forward to. You can fill a streaming platform with content and build a subscriber base. What you can't do is manufacture the kind of genuine excitement that made Endgame a cultural event. That's not a content production problem. That's a storytelling problem, and overproduction was actively making the storytelling harder. The films that landed well in this period almost always did so by being slightly apart from the machinery. No Way Home's emotional accessibility, Guardians Volume 3's James Gunn farewell energy, the WandaVision show's genuine strangeness. The things that worked were the things that still felt like they were made by people with a specific creative vision. The things that didn't work were the things that felt like they were made to fill a slot, and there were a lot of slots to fill. One thing worth noting about this period, which speaks to the experience of actually watching these films and shows rather than just reading about them, is that the overproduction problem was legible on screen even to viewers who didn't know anything about production timelines or studio mandates. People watching Phase 4 content could feel when something hadn't been fully cooked, not necessarily because any individual element was bad, but because of a quality that's hard to name precisely, but easy to recognize. The sense that a story wasn't sure what it was trying to do. Characters making choices that felt like plot requirements rather than character choices. Dialogue that explained things rather than revealing them. A kind of flatness that the best MCU content had never had, even in its less ambitious entries. Thor. The Dark World, generally regarded as one of the weaker Infinity Saga films, still had the specific texture of a film that knew it was a Shakespearean family drama, and committed to that, even when the execution didn't fully get there. It had a tone. Some of the Phase 4 films felt tonally uncertain in a way the Dark World never did. Like they had been developed in a hurry. Like the drafts hadn't quite found their shape before the cameras rolled. That's the production pressure made visible. The audiences who sensed it, who watched a show or a film and thought something felt slightly off, without being able to say exactly what were picking up on something real. There's also a specific thing that happened to the post-credits scene culture in Phase 4 and 5 that's worth mentioning. The post-credits scenes in the Infinity Saga functioned as rewards and as carefully calibrated teasers that advanced the larger story in meaningful ways. The post-credits scenes in Phase 4 and 5 often felt disconnected from the larger narrative, promising setups that then took years to pay off, if they paid off at all. Characters would be introduced in post-credits scenes and then not appear again for 2 or 3 years. The teases stopped feeling like promises and started feeling like obligations, like Marvel was going through the motions of a convention that had stopped serving the purpose it was designed to serve. That erosion of post-credits meaning is a small thing, but small things accumulate. Let me talk about the Multiverse Saga for a bit, because I think it's the thing that gets the most criticism and also the thing that's least well understood in terms of what specifically went wrong. The Infinity Saga had a very simple spine. 6 Infinity Stones scattered across the universe, 1 villain collecting them, 22 films building toward a confrontation. Even if you hadn't watched every film, you could follow the shape of the threat because it had a coherent geography. There's a thing. Someone is trying to collect the thing. If they collect all of it, everything ends. That's not a complicated concept to grasp. The Multiverse Saga's premise is structurally different in ways that turned out to matter enormously. Infinite parallel universes, infinite variants of existing characters, a threat that doesn't come from one place or one direction, but potentially from every direction simultaneously. From a storytelling standpoint, infinite possibility is actually significantly harder to make emotionally compelling than a clearly defined finite stakes. When anything can happen, the things that happen carry less weight. When the villain could be anyone, and the danger could come from anywhere, the narrative tension that the Infinity Saga generated through specific, trackable escalation becomes very hard to recreate. The Infinity Stones worked because they gave every phase a connective thread that audiences could follow, even casually. The multiverse didn't provide that. It provided a concept rather than a structure, and those are different things. A concept is something you can explain. A structure is something you can feel. The introduction of Kang the Conqueror as the successor to Thanos is worth thinking about in the abstract, before we get into what happened with the actor specifically. Thanos was a villain whose motivation you could understand in about 30 seconds, even if you disagreed with it. He thought the universe had finite resources and was heading toward catastrophic scarcity, so he decided to halve the population to buy time. Monstrous logic, but logic. You didn't need a mythology primer to understand what he wanted. Kang, as a concept, required significantly more setup. Time-traveling conqueror from the far future. Multiple variants existing across multiple timelines. A council of Kangs. The Time Variance Authority. Sacred timelines and timeline branches and temporal pruning. These are interesting ideas if you follow them carefully through multiple films and shows, but they don't compress into a single clean sentence the way Thanos does. And for a franchise that was already struggling with the homework problem, the sense that you had to watch everything to follow anything, adding a villain whose concept itself required explanation put additional pressure on an audience that was already looking for reasons to simplify their viewing habits. The tonal chaos of Phase 4 and 5 is the other dimension of this problem, and it's something the numbers don't fully capture. Think about what these films were, genre-wise, placed next to each other. Black Panther, Wakanda. Forever is a grief drama, genuinely moving, sincerely made, about a community processing collective loss. Thor, Love and Thunder is a comedy. A broad, bright, intentionally irreverent comedy, with screaming goats and vivid colour palettes and jokes about rock people. Eternals is a philosophical epic about cosmic beings debating whether humanity deserves to survive. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is a Sam Raimi horror film with genuine jump scares and body horror that would have earned it a harder rating in an earlier era. Each of those tonal choices is defensible individually. The MCU's tonal flexibility was one of its strengths during the Infinity Saga. The difference is that in Phase 2 and 3, the individual tonal experiments were held together by the connective tissue of a coherent ongoing story. Each film felt like an episode of the same show, even when the genres varied. In Phase 4 and 5, the tonal variety felt more like disconnection, entries in a franchise that wasn't sure what register it was operating in, or what kind of thing it was trying to be. There's also the absence of an assembly film, which is something that doesn't get discussed enough. During the Infinity Saga, Marvel used team-up films as punctuation. Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame brought the ensemble together in ways that gave the individual franchise threads meaning and momentum. Even fans who weren't closely following every character got a reminder, in these films, of why all the separate stories mattered and how they connected. Phase 4 and 5 produced no equivalent. Characters were introduced, given their own films or shows, and then left sitting in their respective corners of the universe with no visible connective tissue pulling them toward a shared event that audiences could look forward to. The wait for an Avengers-level assembly is, at the time I'm recording this, approaching 7 years since Endgame. 7 years. The MCU's new generation of characters has been introduced. Sam Wilson's Captain America, Wanda Maximoff's Arc, Shang-Chi, Moon Knight, She-Hulk, Ms. Marvel, the various Loki variants, and they haven't assembled. They haven't been in a room together. Audiences haven't had a reason to care about them collectively the way they cared about the original 6, because the original 6 were repeatedly shown in relation to each other, tested against each other, forced to make choices that defined them in each other's company. The Multiverse Saga promised to be building towards something. The problem is that, after several years of building, audiences stopped being able to see what it was building toward. And once that clarity disappears, it's hard to maintain enthusiasm for the individual pieces. There's one more dimension of the multiverse problem I want to spend a moment on, which is the question of emotional geography. The Infinity Saga worked partly because it had physical spaces the audience understood and cared about. Earth, New York, Wakanda, Asgard, Titan. These were places with a felt reality, places you'd spent time in, places where you knew what it meant when someone you cared about was in danger there. The universe had landmarks. The quantum realm, which became a pivotal setting for the Multiverse Saga's middle period, resisted that kind of grounding by design. It's a place of infinite possibility and no fixed geography, which is conceptually interesting but emotionally slippery. You can't care about what might be lost in a place that has no edges. The multiverse as a concept has the same problem. If there are infinite realities, the stakes in any one of them become harder to feel, because the threat of losing this version of events sits against the background of infinitely many other versions where things turned out differently. Thanos wanted to wipe out half of all life in one specific universe that everyone was living in. That's concrete. Kang wanted to conquer the multiverse, which is an idea rather than a consequence. The scale is larger, but the emotional proximity is smaller, and emotional proximity is what makes audiences hold their breath. Now, none of this means the Multiverse Saga was doomed as a concept. There were individual entries, both Loki seasons, No Way Home, that found ways to make multiverse material emotionally grounded. The trick in those cases was to anchor the multiversal stakes to a single character's personal story, to make the infinite feel intimate by having the infinite threaten something specific and irreplaceable. That approach worked when it was applied. It wasn't applied consistently enough. Now let's talk about the actual films and shows for a while, because there's something worth doing in just walking through the notable misfires of the Phase 4 and 5 period, one by one. Not as a prosecution. I don't think any of these are the product of people not trying or not caring or not having talent. I think they're the product of a system that had developed specific structural problems, and the films and shows were where those problems became visible to audiences. So let's move through them. Black Widow came out in July of 2021 as a simultaneous theatrical and Disney Plus release. Scarlett Johansson had been playing Natasha Romanoff since Iron Man 2 in 2010. She had been one of the franchise's most consistent presences for 11 years, and her character had never had a solo film, despite being one of the original 6 Avengers, and in Infinity War, one of the most emotionally central characters in the story. The solo film eventually arrived after her character had already died in Endgame, as a period story set between Civil War and Infinity War. The timing problem is obvious in retrospect. A Black Widow film in 2013 or 2015, when the character was alive and audiences were deeply invested in her survival, would have been a very different proposition than a prequel film in 2021 about a character the audience had already said goodbye to. The film itself was decent enough, honestly. A spy thriller with a strong ensemble cast and some genuinely entertaining action sequences, but it couldn't escape the sense of arriving after the moment had passed. And then Johansson sued Disney over the dual theatrical streaming release, arguing that her contract had guaranteed a theatrical-only release and that the Disney Plus simultaneous drop had reduced her box office-based compensation. Disney settled. The suit itself became the story, and the film was somewhat buried under the noise of it. Eternals opens in Mesopotamia, 5000 BC, in golden natural light, with Chloe Zhao's camera moving the way it did in Nomadland, wide, unhurried, close to the earth. There's a battle sequence in the first 10 minutes that looks genuinely unlike anything Marvel had made before, and not because of its scale, because of its stillness. For about 45 seconds, you think you might be watching something that could change what this franchise is capable of. The central concept is fascinating. 10 cosmic beings have lived among humans for 7,000 years, watching wars and plagues and injustices without intervening, forbidden from interfering except against a specific category of threat. The moral weight of that inaction is real. Zhao clearly cared about it. The problem arrives slowly, as you realise there are 10 of them. 10 new characters introduced simultaneously, each with distinct powers, personalities and backstories, with about 2.5 hours to make you care about all of them equally. The Infinity Saga spent years building the audience's relationship to its characters. Eternals tried to compress that investment into a single film. It couldn't be done, and the film ends up feeling like a very beautiful object with no one inside it. I wanted it to work. It didn't quite. Thor: Love and Thunder, Taika Waititi's Thor: Ragnarok, was one of the most loved films in Phase 3. It completely reinvented the Thor franchise by leaning into absurdist comedy and vivid colour and genuine irreverence for the superhero format. It was a film that understood exactly what it was and committed fully to that understanding. It was wonderful. Love and Thunder tried to replicate that energy without the underlying structure that made Ragnarok work. Ragnarok worked because its comedy was earned against genuine stakes. Thor had just lost his hammer. His father was dying. His home was about to be destroyed. The lightness worked because the weight was real. Love and Thunder's comedy arrived in contexts where the weight wasn't quite calibrated to hold it. Christian Bale was playing Gore the God Butcher, a villain whose concept is genuinely terrifying, a man so consumed by grief and rage at the gods that he dedicates his existence to killing every single one of them. And he delivered a quietly haunting performance. But the film kept pivoting away from Gore's darkness toward broad comedy about screaming goats and Zeus's toga, and the tonal whiplash was hard to absorb. Waititi is a talented filmmaker, and the film has its admirers, but the critical consensus that it was a significant step down from Ragnarok felt accurate to a lot of viewers. She-Hulk, Attorney at Law. The most interesting thing about She-Hulk, Attorney at Law, is probably not the show itself. It's what happened around it. A portion of the MCU fanbase responded to it with a degree of hostility that didn't quite match the actual content on screen. It was a legal comedy, deliberately low stakes, fourth wall breaking, Fleabag adjacent, built explicitly around not being a typical MCU action property. Not for everyone, not a disaster. What the She-Hulk discourse revealed is that 15 years of training audiences to expect spectacle and saga had created a specific rigidity in parts of the fanbase. Projects that departed from the template weren't being evaluated on their own terms. They were being punished for not being something they never claimed to be. Whether you think that reflects a problem with the show, or a problem with the expectations, says something about where you stand on what the MCU should be allowed to be. I lean toward the expectations being the issue, but either way, the reaction tells you something real about where the audience relationship was by 2022. Secret Invasion is the one I find hardest to defend. It was positioned as a grounded political thriller about Skrull infiltrators in positions of global power, a kind of paranoid spy drama in the MCU. Samuel L. Jackson, who'd been playing Nick Fury since 2008, finally got a lead vehicle. The premise had real potential. The execution was, by fairly broad consensus, a misfire. The storytelling felt rushed, the stakes never landed with the clarity required to make the paranoia work, and the payoff of several years of Fury-centric setup felt inadequate. Don Cheadle, who appeared as James Rhodes, later described the experience diplomatically as not what anyone wanted it to be, which is the kind of thing people say when they want to acknowledge something went wrong without getting specific about why. The deeper problem with Secret Invasion is what it did with a character who had been one of the MCU's most reliable presences since the very beginning. Nick Fury is the spine of the franchise in a structural sense. He's the person who assembled the Avengers, who saw the threat before anyone else, who held the whole operation together from the shadows. Giving him a lead show and producing something that audiences found underwhelming did specific damage to a franchise asset that had taken 15 years to build. Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania was supposed to be Kang's arrival as the new defining threat of the franchise. The previous Ant-Man films had been consistently enjoyable, lighter in tone than the mainline Avengers films, more comedic, a pleasant place in the MCU landscape. Quantumania was going to change that by taking the franchise to the quantum realm and making it the stage for an Avengers-level confrontation. It didn't work. The reviews were the worst of the 3 Ant-Man films. The VFX problems that had been building across several productions became visible enough at the premiere that industry observers mentioned them publicly. And the film's most important job, making audiences afraid of and invested in Kang as a villain, was largely not accomplished. Part of that is the structural problem I mentioned earlier about Kang as a concept being harder to distill than Thanos. Part of it is that Quantumania tried to introduce a world, a threat, and a new villain simultaneously, and the seams showed. The Ant-Man franchise was also, somewhat sadly, a casualty of what came after. The issues with Jonathan Majors meaning that the Kang setup Quantumania had carefully constructed was effectively dismantled before it could pay off. The Marvels. And then there's The Marvels, which is the number I keep coming back to, $206 million worldwide, a sequel to Captain Marvel, which had made $1.13 billion. That's not a modest underperformance. That's a historical anomaly in franchise filmmaking. Several factors collided at once. The SAG-AFTRA strike in 2023 prevented cast members from doing press, so the film launched without the promotional infrastructure that major releases rely on. The title change from Captain Marvel 2 to The Marvels reduced name recognition for casual audiences who might not have known what they were being invited to see. The film required familiarity with the Ms. Marvel Disney Plus series and WandaVision and the previous Captain Marvel film to fully follow the character dynamics, which was, as Feige later acknowledged, simply too much to ask of a general audience. The film itself, seen without the box office context, is actually relatively well made. It's entertaining, the dynamic between the three leads is actually fun, and there are individual sequences that work quite well, but none of that changed the reality of what the numbers said. The Marvels landed as the symbolic low point of everything that had gone wrong with the franchise's relationship to its audience, and it became the film that most visibly forced Marvel to reckon with what the previous several years had actually cost them. A few other entries from this period are worth touching on briefly because they illustrate different aspects of the same structural problem rather than repeating the same failure. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Doctor Strange 2 is an interesting case because it's technically one of the more successful Phase 4 films commercially. It crossed $900 million at the box office, but the critical and audience discourse around it revealed a specific tension that the multiverse concept was generating. The film used Wanda Maximoff as its villain, continuing her arc from WandaVision and essentially completing a character regression from the emotionally rich figure of that show back into an obstacle to be defeated. Sam Raimi directed it, and Raimi's horror sensibility is genuinely present. There are sequences in this film that are genuinely unsettling in ways that the franchise rarely attempted. But the tonal experience of watching a Marvel film through a Sam Raimi horror lens, while also processing the Wanda character's trajectory and keeping track of multiverse-introduced variants and trying to follow what the Illuminati sequence meant, required a level of cognitive engagement that a lot of casual viewers weren't prepared to bring on a Saturday afternoon. It also killed Professor X in a way that many fans found difficult, partly because Patrick Stewart's appearance had generated enormous excitement, and partly because his death felt abrupt in a way that suggested the film's primary interest in him was the cameo rather than the character. That's a pattern that recurred in Phase 4 and 5, exciting casting announcements that resolved into disappointments, which has a specific corrosive effect on audience enthusiasm because it makes the excitement itself feel foolish in retrospect. Moon Knight, somewhere around 2022, Oscar Isaac gave one of the most committed performances in the franchise's Disney Plus era. A man with dissociative identity disorder, navigating an Egyptian mythology, delivering scenes that required him to be two entirely different people in the same body, with no physical transition between them. The show was strange in a productive way, disconnected from the wider MCU in ways that actually helped it breathe. Worth watching if you haven't. And then nothing. Moon Knight has not appeared meaningfully in any subsequent film or show. The character stopped. Shang-Chi is the same story. A well-received film, a legitimately interesting new character, a post-credits sequence that sent a signal across the universe, and then years of silence while the sequel sat in development. The Multiverse Saga introduced more new characters than any previous phase, and in several cases simply didn't have a plan for what to do with them afterward. That's not a small problem when one of the things that kept audiences invested in the Infinity Saga was the feeling that every introduction was purposeful. Let's talk about Kang properly now, because the Kang storyline represents probably the single most damaging structural collapse in the franchise's post-Endgame period, and it happened in layers. Jonathan Majors made his first appearance as He Who Remains in the Season 1 finale of Loki in 2021. The character was the keeper of the sacred timeline, the man sitting at the end of time who had spent eons preventing a multiversal war by controlling which timelines were allowed to exist. He was compelling in a very specific way. Majors played him as simultaneously powerful and exhausted, someone who had lived so long doing something terrible in service of something necessary that the distinction between purpose and despair had mostly collapsed. It was a genuinely interesting performance in a genuinely interesting role. Marvel's plan was clear and ambitious. Majors would play multiple Kang variants across multiple films and shows across Phase 4, 5 and 6. He would serve as the connective villain of the entire Multiverse Saga in the way Thanos had served the Infinity Saga, a presence that grew in significance across many individual entries before the full reckoning in the Avengers-level films. He appeared in Quantum Mania as a different, more overtly threatening Kang variant. He appeared in Loki Season 2. Avengers. The Kang Dynasty was announced as the next major team-up event. The whole architecture of the Multiverse Saga was built around him. Then in March of 2023, Majors was arrested on assault charges. Disney and Marvel adopted a public wait-and-see approach, noting that Kang Dynasty wasn't scheduled to begin production for some time, and that the legal process needed to play out. By December of 2023, Majors had been convicted on 2 charges. Marvel fired him the same day. The practical consequences for the franchise were significant in ways that are worth walking through calmly. The entire Kang setup, the Council of Kangs revealed in Quantum Mania's post-credits scene, the time variant mythology built across both Loki seasons, the specific threat that was supposed to bring the new generation of Avengers together, was now attached to an actor the studio could no longer use. The franchise had invested 3 years and multiple major releases into building a villain architecture around a single performer, and that architecture had to be dismantled. Avengers, the Kang Dynasty, was renamed, first to just Avengers 5, while Marvel figured out what to do, and eventually to Avengers, Doomsday with a new villain entirely. Dr. Doom, with Robert Downey Jr. attached in an announcement that Marvel made at San Diego Comic-Con in 2024. The Robert Downey Jr. announcement is worth sitting with for a moment because the reaction to it was revealing. The internet lit up in a way that Marvel announcements hadn't lit up in years. The engagement was genuine. People who had drifted away from following the MCU were suddenly talking about it again, which tells you something fairly clearly about where the emotional investment actually still lived. It lived with Tony Stark, with the original era, with the specific performers who had defined the franchise during the Infinity Saga. Audiences weren't excited about Dr. Doom abstractly. They were excited about Robert Downey Jr. That's not a criticism of the decision. It might be exactly the right move for where the franchise is right now, but it's also a signal about the depth of the problem. When the biggest audience response your franchise has generated in several years is the return of the actor from the previous era, you are not in the process of successfully building a new era. You are running, at least partly, on the credit of the old one. There's also a production oversight question embedded in the Kang situation that the franchise probably needs to reckon with at some level. Building the central arc of a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar franchise around a single performer without apparent contingency planning for the possibility that the performer might not be available, that's an unusual institutional risk. The Infinity Saga had a similar level of investment in Robert Downey Jr., but by the time the Infinity Saga reached its climax, Tony Stark's arc was so deeply established across so many films that the story could carry itself. Kang hadn't had that amount of time. The character was still in the setup phase when the situation forced a full reset. The Loki Season 2 finale, which aired during the period of Major's trial in 2023, did something interesting in this context. Without getting into the full plot, the ending essentially retired the Kang storyline in a way that gave Marvel an exit ramp. The character's narrative function was reassigned to Loki himself. Feige and the writers had apparently prepared for the possibility that Kang might not be available for the larger saga, and they found a way to close that thread without requiring a single additional Major's appearance. That kind of creative agility is worth acknowledging. But it doesn't change the fact that the franchise spent 3 years building a villain arc that had to be abandoned, and that the 6 or 7 years between Endgame and the next Avengers-level film will have been spent without a coherent, overarching antagonist visible to the audience. The most telling detail about all of this is probably the simplest one. When the Doomsday announcement came with Robert Downey Jr. attached as Doctor Doom, it generated more genuine audience energy than anything Marvel had announced in years. Not because Doom is so exciting in the abstract, but because Downey was coming back. The emotional investment the announcement tapped into was entirely from the previous era, which tells you clearly where the franchise's remaining credit still lives. The Doctor Doom choice is, in isolation, genuinely promising. Doom is one of the most significant characters in Marvel's comic book history, a villain whose complexity and philosophical weight go far beyond what the MCU's Phase 4 and 5 antagonists had offered. He's a ruler, a sorcerer, a scientist, a man whose arrogance is inseparable from his genuine genius, whose face was scarred by an accident. He could have survived intact if he'd been willing to admit he made a small error. The specific nature of Doom's wound, that he could have accepted a tiny scar and chose instead to bury himself in hot iron rather than acknowledge imperfection, is one of the most interesting psychological origin stories in superhero fiction. Downey bringing his energy to that character, in whatever form the film takes, has genuine potential. The question, as always with the MCU now, is whether that potential is fully realised or whether it's partially squandered by the same conditions that have hampered Phase 4 and 5. The reduced production pace and the standalone approach suggest the conditions might be better. The fact that we're talking about it as potential rather than achievement means the proof is still to come. Let me spend a bit of time on the box office data, because the numbers tell a story that's worth reading carefully. Not as a horror story, but as a factual record of where things went. Phase 3 is the benchmark. 11 films, $13.5 billion globally. 6 of those films crossed $1 billion individually. Endgame alone made nearly $2.8 billion. Civil War and Infinity War each crossed $1 billion. Black Panther and Spider-Man, Far From Home each grossed over $1 billion, while Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 grossed over $860 million. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 grossed about $869 million. These were not niche successes. These were films that competed with anything else in cinema during those years. Phase 4, which ran from Black Widow through Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, made around $5.7 billion, significantly lower than Phase 3, but with meaningful context. The pandemic disrupted the theatrical business significantly, and Phase 4 contained Spider-Man: No Way Home, which made close to $1.9 billion despite releasing during a period of continuing COVID concerns. That one film was doing an enormous amount of lifting for the phase's overall numbers. Remove No Way Home, and Phase 4's theatrical performance looks considerably thinner. Phase 5 is where the numbers become genuinely remarkable in their own way. The phase grossed roughly $3.6 billion globally, making it the lowest grossing phase in the franchise's history, below Phase 1, which was built on characters nobody had heard of, with modest budgets and no established track record. And Phase 5 had the same caveat as Phase 4. 2 films were doing most of the work. Deadpool and Wolverine made around $1.34 billion. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 made about $845 million. Those two titles together accounted for roughly 60% of the Phase's entire box office. The remaining films averaged somewhere around $300 million each. There's an important pattern in that data. The films that performed were sequels and franchise extensions with built-in emotional investment from the previous Infinity Saga era. Guardians Volume 3 was a James Gunn farewell to characters audiences had been with since 2014. Deadpool and Wolverine was running on a decade of Deadpool fanbase enthusiasm, plus Hugh Jackman's Wolverine, who audiences had been watching since 2000. These weren't Phase 5 successes in a pure sense. They were late Infinity Saga investments finally cashing out. The actually new Phase 5 material, the properties the Multiverse Saga was trying to establish as the next generation, struggled consistently. The global top 10 streak deserves a mention too. From 2012 onward, at least one MCU film had finished in the worldwide top 10 box office every single year, except 2020, when no MCU films were released at all due to the pandemic. That streak held through Deadpool and Wolverine in 2024. It ended in 2025, when none of the Phase 5 films that released in that calendar year managed a top 10 global finish. There's also a Disney Plus dimension to the numbers story that complicates the picture in interesting ways. The streaming performance of MCU content, the degree to which new releases drove subscription sign-ups, the hours viewed per title, the retention of subscribers who came for Marvel, was a significant part of Disney's internal justification for the overproduction strategy. But streaming metrics aren't public the way theatrical box office is, which means Disney could tell itself a reasonably positive story about franchise health on the basis of streaming numbers even when theatrical was visibly struggling. At some point the streaming argument stopped being sufficient internally because the course correction happened. Making less is not a decision you make if every metric is pointing toward making more. The decision to scale back was driven by a recognition that something structural had gone wrong, and that recognition was probably taking into account a broader set of signals about audience engagement than just the box office figures. I want to be careful not to catastrophize these numbers, though, because I don't think they tell a catastrophic story. But what they tell is a more nuanced one. The MCU is still producing films that earn hundreds of millions of dollars. It is still one of the most commercially significant franchises in cinema. The story isn't Marvel is finished. The story is Marvel has a specific problem that produced a specific and quantifiable decline, and the question of whether that problem can be solved is still open. What I find striking about the Phase 5 numbers, personally, isn't the total. It's the distribution. 2 films doing 60% of the gross, the rest averaging around $300 million. That distribution is a picture of a franchise where the things that used to drive broad excitement are gone, and the remaining audience is showing up for sequels and nostalgia and specific creative reputations, not for the franchise itself. That's a meaningfully different kind of commercial proposition than what the Infinity Saga was. The instructive comparison is to the superhero genre as a whole. The quick conclusion many people reached was that audiences were suffering from superhero fatigue, that the category had been played out, and the decline was inevitable. But that doesn't hold up against the evidence. James Gunn's Superman film performed well in 2025. Christopher Nolan's Batman films had done extraordinary business years earlier. The genre works when the storytelling is accessible, the emotional stakes are clear, and the entry point doesn't require a significant amount of prior knowledge. Feige made exactly this point in a 2025 interview, pointing to Superman's performance as evidence that the demand for superhero stories hadn't disappeared. "It's clearly not superhero fatigue," he said. The problem was more specific than that. A franchise that had made itself difficult to join and difficult to follow, that had overproduced at the expense of quality control, and that was navigating the post-Endgame period without the characters or the narrative clarity that had made the Infinity Saga so commercially dominant. That's a problem that can theoretically be solved, and Marvel is in the process of trying to solve it. This whole conversation would be incomplete, and honestly a bit unfair, without spending some time on the things from this period that actually worked. Because there were things that worked, genuinely, meaningfully worked. Not in the decent for a Phase 5 film sense, but in the proper, this is good television or film sense. WandaVision. WandaVision was the first Disney Plus Marvel show, and it remains one of the most interesting, creative achievements the franchise has produced in any medium. The premise? One to Maximoff, deep in grief after Vision's death, has unconsciously created a pocket reality around a New Jersey suburb and forced its residents to live inside a decades-spanning TV show, moving from 1950s sitcom format through the 1960s, 70s, 80s and 90s, is genuinely strange. It's the kind of premise that a studio might reasonably have said no to, and the fact that it got made and that it worked is worth appreciating. Elizabeth Olsen gave a performance that was operating at a level the franchise didn't always ask of its performers. The specific grief at the centre of WandaVision, the grief of someone who never got to mourn, who never got to sit with her loss, who kept being required to move on to the next crisis, was rendered with real delicacy. The line, "What is grief if not love persevering?" became one of the most quoted lines in the franchise's history. For good reason, it's genuinely earned. WandaVision demonstrated what the Disney Plus platform could theoretically do for Marvel storytelling: create space for slower, character-centered work that the theatrical films couldn't always accommodate. The tragedy is that the storytelling lessons of WandaVision weren't always applied to what followed. Loki, both seasons of Loki, worked in ways that felt surprising for a character who had, for most of his MCU existence, been used primarily as a foil and a source of charming menace. Tom Hiddleston had been playing Loki since 2011, and the show finally gave him a full arc, a character defined by mischief and self-interested chaos, learning, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, that he actually cares about other people. The Season 1 finale's introduction of He Who Remains was as strong a villain introduction as the franchise had managed in years. The Season 2 finale gave Loki something rare in this franchise, a properly complete ending. The image of Loki at the close of the series, the specific visual of where the character ends up and what he chooses, is one of the strongest final images the franchise has produced. I won't get into specifics for anyone who hasn't seen it, but it earns its place. Spider-Man. No Way Home. No Way Home made close to $1.9 billion during the tail end of the pandemic in 2021, which tells you that when a Marvel film gave audiences something emotionally compelling and genuinely accessible, they still showed up in enormous numbers. The film worked because it grounded its multiverse premise in a very specific, emotional core: Peter Parker's desperate attempt to protect the people he loves from the consequences of his mistakes. And because it used the fan service, the multiple Spider-Men, the returning villains, in service of that emotional core, rather than as a substitute for it. The scene where the three Peters talk to each other about loss and responsibility is the film's real climax, not the battle. It worked because it was about something that anyone could follow, regardless of how much MCU homework they had done. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. James Gunn had spent 9 years with these characters, across 3 films. Volume 3 was his farewell, and it showed in the best possible way. The film handled Rocket Raccoon's backstory, the origin story of where he came from and what was done to him, with a darkness and a genuine heartbreak that the franchise had rarely attempted. The scenes set in the High Evolutionaries facility are deeply upsetting in a way that felt honest rather than gratuitous. Gunn made a film that was about what his 9 years with these characters had actually meant, about found family, about the damage people carry from their origins, about the possibility of choosing who you are rather than being defined by what was done to you. It's the best third film in any MCU trilogy, and the note it ended on, scattering the Guardians into their own new chapters, Felt like a proper completion in a franchise that wasn't always comfortable with endings. Loki Season 2's finale and its predecessors. I've already mentioned this, but the Season 2 finale of Loki deserves separate acknowledgement because of what it accomplished under difficult circumstances. Shot and produced during the period when the Kang situation was creating real uncertainty about the franchise's direction. The finale essentially solved several interconnected narrative problems at once, closing the Kang thread, completing Loki's arc, and giving the entire two-season run a coherent conclusion. That level of narrative problem-solving, done quietly and without fanfare, represents exactly the kind of creative craft that the franchise produces at its best. What all of these bright spots have in common is worth naming explicitly. Each of them had a clear emotional core that didn't require extensive prior knowledge to feel. Each was made with a specific creative vision. WandaVision's weird grief TV experiment, Gunn's farewell, Loki's character completion, rather than as content filling a production slot. Each asked something genuine of its audience and delivered something genuine in return. The conditions that produced these things were possible even within the overcrowded schedule of Phase 4 and 5. The problem was that they weren't consistent, and in a franchise that was asking audiences to watch everything, the gaps between the genuine achievements were filled with things that didn't quite get there. There's something worth adding here about a show that I'd place in the bright spots category despite its more mixed general reception: Hawkeye. The Hawkeye show from 2021 is quieter than anything I've mentioned above. A Christmas-set thriller about a retired Avenger trying to get home for the holidays and getting pulled into a New York crime story instead. It introduced Kate Bishop, played by Haley Steinfeld, as a genuinely compelling new character. And it did something the franchise often didn't in Phase 4. It made Clint Barton feel fully human. The episode where Clint goes to a Broadway musical about the Avengers and has to watch himself portrayed as a character in someone else's adventure, someone the audience sees as inspiring and heroic, while Clint sees himself as a man carrying enormous amounts of guilt and grief, is one of the more thoughtful character moments in the franchise's streaming era. The show understood its character. That's all it takes. And it's not as easy as it sounds. The bright spots from Phase 4 and 5 all share a quality that's worth making explicit one more time, because it's the lesson the franchise needed to internalise broadly, and mostly didn't. The things that worked knew what they were. WandaVision was a grief study wearing a sitcom costume. Loki was a time travel adventure about identity and choice. Guardians 3 was a James Gunn goodbye letter to characters he had built. Hawkeye was a Christmas story about a man who wanted to go home. Each of these had a simple, clear emotional spine that you could describe in a sentence. The entries that didn't work almost always lacked that clarity. They were pursuing multiple tonal registers, or servicing multiple franchise obligations, or trying to do too many things at once and arriving at none of them fully. Simple doesn't mean simplistic. WandaVision was complex and strange. Loki was philosophically ambitious. Guardians 3 was properly heartbreaking. But their complexity was organised around a clear centre. That centre is what the Phase 4 and 5 output was missing when it missed. Now let's talk about the audience for a bit, because I think this is the dimension of the story that gets the least attention and matters the most. The MCU at its peak wasn't just a collection of successful films, it was a participatory culture. There's a real difference between those things, and the difference matters. During the Infinity Saga, the audience wasn't passive. People rewatched films looking for Easter eggs. They maintained theories about where the story was going across multiple films. They speculated about post-credit scenes before they'd been confirmed. They argued about whose side they were on after Civil War. They counted down months to release dates, and then spent weeks talking about what they'd just seen. The gap between films wasn't dead time. It was filled with a kind of ongoing community engagement that was itself a form of entertainment. The MCU between 2012 and 2019 was something you participated in, not just something you consumed. That participatory energy is enormously valuable to a franchise, and it's also enormously fragile. It depends on the audience feeling like the franchise is honouring their investment. The Disney Plus era disrupted the rhythm of that participation in a specific way. The constant availability of new content removed the gap, the space where the theories and the anticipation lived. There was no waiting period. Something new was always arriving. The speculation cycle that had been such a significant part of audience engagement couldn't develop properly when the next piece of the puzzle arrived before you'd finished thinking about the last one. But the deeper problem was the shift in how audiences felt about their investment. That homework dynamic we talked about earlier, the sense that the MCU had become an obligation rather than a pleasure, had a specific psychological consequence that's worth naming. The act of leaving a franchise is, for most people, not a conscious decision. It's a drift. You miss one film and tell yourself you'll catch up. You watch the next one without having seen the last one and find yourself confused or less engaged. You realise the confusion is now structural, that the franchise has moved on from the characters you knew and replaced them with new ones you haven't had time to get attached to. And at some point, you quietly stop tracking what's coming out. Getting those people back is genuinely hard. Not impossible, but hard, because the decision to stop following something is rarely reversed by the franchise getting better. It's reversed by the franchise doing something specific enough to cut through to people who have stopped paying attention. Something that functions as a re-invitation rather than a continuation of the thing they already left. The Robert Downey Jr. announcement functioned as one of those re-invitations, which is almost certainly part of why Marvel made it. But it also revealed the dynamic clearly. The loudest audience signal the franchise had gotten in years was the promise of return to the era the audience had loved, not the promise of something new. That's not necessarily a permanent state of affairs, but it is the current one. There's one more dimension of the original cast question worth sitting with, which is about the specific emotional intelligence of the Infinity Saga performances and why it matters that that level of commitment was sustained across a decade. Scarlett Johansson's Natasha Romanoff is worth thinking about in this context. Natasha was never given a solo film during the Infinity Saga, a decision that was widely and fairly criticised, but she was one of the most consistently present characters across the ensemble films. And in those films, she was frequently the character doing the most emotionally sophisticated work. In the first Avengers, she's the one who actually understands Loki, who reads him correctly while everyone else is reacting to him. In Winter Soldier, she's the character whose relationship with the intelligence community is the most complicated and the most honest. In Civil War, she's navigating between two men she respects who have decided to destroy each other, and she makes choices that have consequences rather than making easy ones. Johansson played all of this with an understatement that sometimes meant the work went unacknowledged, because understated performance is easy to overlook. But rewatch those films with attention on Natasha, and the sophistication is evident. The specific quality Johansson brought, the sense of a character who is always thinking several moves ahead, who is always more vulnerable than she appears, who carries the cost of her history without performing it, gave the ensemble a texture it would have lacked without her. Mark Ruffalo's Bruce Banner is another one worth noting. The specific approach Ruffalo brought, the quality of barely contained anxiety, of a brilliant man perpetually on the edge of losing control of something enormous, was remarkably consistent across 7 appearances spanning a decade. The payoff of that consistency in Endgame, where Bruce has finally integrated with the Hulk and exists in a settled acceptance of both sides of himself, works precisely because you've spent years watching how hard that integration was. These are craft achievements at a level that any long-form creative work aspires to, and their achievements that the audience absorbed in a largely unconscious way. You didn't necessarily think, what a remarkable consistent arc Mark Ruffalo has played across 7 films. You just felt it. You felt that Bruce was familiar, that you knew how he responded to things, that his choices made sense in a specific and personal way. That familiarity, that quiet intimacy with a character's inner life, is what Phase 4 and 5 was trying to build, with a new cast while simultaneously overproducing and reducing the time available for any single character to develop that depth. It's genuinely hard. Not impossible. Loki managed it with Tom Hiddleston across 2 seasons, and The Guardians managed it across 3 films. But it requires time and consistency, and a production approach that prioritizes depth over volume. There's also something worth naming about the way the MCU's overproduction changed the cultural conversation around it. During the Infinity Saga, there was a constant media discourse about what Marvel was building, where it was going, and what it all meant. Film critics who didn't particularly care about superhero films engaged with it because the scale and ambition of the project were genuinely unprecedented. Journalists wrote serious analytical pieces about the MCU as a phenomenon. By Phase 5, that discourse had shifted. The conversation was now about whether the MCU was in trouble, whether superhero fatigue was real, whether the franchise had overstayed its welcome. That shift in media framing, from "what is this remarkable thing building toward?" to "is this remarkable thing still remarkable?" affects how audiences approach each new release. When a franchise becomes a referendum on itself rather than an event, the casual viewer's relationship to it changes. And once that shift happens in the media coverage, it feeds back into audience perception in ways that are very difficult to reverse. There's a specific way the trust erosion worked that I want to try to describe, because I think it gets at something important about why it's so hard to reverse. During the Infinity Saga, every film felt like it was in conversation with what had come before. The continuity wasn't just logistical, it was emotional. Things that happened in one film had visible consequences in the next. Tony Stark's PTSD from the Battle of New York was present in Iron Man 3. The fracture between Steve and Tony in Civil War made Infinity War feel legitimately uncertain about whether they could work together when it mattered most. Wanda's grief over Pietro's death in Age of Ultron was the emotional foundation that made WandaVision possible years later. The franchise remembered things. It honoured the weight of events by letting them persist. Phase 4 and 5 had a more complicated relationship with continuity. Some threads were tracked carefully. Wanda's arc, Loki's evolution, the Captain America succession story. Others were dropped or deferred in ways that created a sense of narrative carelessness. Characters made decisions with significant implied consequences that were never examined. Setups went unresolved for years. The Infinity Saga had trained audiences to believe that everything mattered, that every detail was intentional and would eventually pay off. Phase 4 and 5 occasionally violated that expectation, and each violation taught audiences to hold the franchise a little more loosely. The relationship between an audience and a franchise is similar in some ways to the relationship between a reader and a novelist. You start trusting the author's choices because the choices have been good. You follow them into territory you don't fully understand, because you've learnt they know where they're going. But if the author makes choices that seem arbitrary, or if they introduce plot threads they then abandon, or if they change established character behaviour without sufficient cause, you start reading differently. Less trustingly, more guardedly. And once you're reading that way, the experience is fundamentally changed, even when the writing is good. That's what happened to the MCU's relationship with a significant portion of its audience during Phase 4 and 5. The faith that everything was deliberate and meaningful, faith that had been built across 11 years and proven correct at the largest possible scale by Endgame, started to erode. And once you're watching a Marvel project with that guarded quality, looking for evidence that this one is going somewhere real rather than just setting up more content, the experience is materially different from what watching the Infinity Saga had been. Some of that guardedness is still present in how audiences approach the franchise now, even as the course correction proceeds. It'll take sustained quality over time to dissolve it. That's not a quick fix. It's a years-long project. There's a dimension of this story that's easy to state, but hard to fully account for, and it has to do with the specific alchemy of the original cast. Robert Downey Jr. played Tony Stark across 11 films from 2008 to 2019. That's a decade of a single performer inhabiting a single character with genuine consistency and genuine creative investment. Tony Stark in 2008 is witty, self-regarding, brilliant, and pretty clearly emotionally stunted. Tony Stark in Endgame is all of those things, and also a husband and a father, and someone who has spent years genuinely grappling with the consequences of what he built and what he set in motion. That arc, the distance between the man in the cave in Afghanistan, building a suit to survive, and the man snapping his fingers to save the universe, took 11 years to travel. You can't shortcut it. Chris Evans played Steve Rogers for roughly the same period. The specific achievement of Evans' performance was making genuine virtue compelling, playing a man whose defining characteristic is that he does the right thing, and making that interesting rather than pious, which is significantly harder than it sounds. Steve Rogers works because Evans found the stubbornness and the cost and the loneliness inside the goodness. The character's final scene in Endgame, old, peaceful, having lived the life he was always trying to protect other people's right to have, works as an emotional conclusion because of 11 years of accumulated understanding of who Steve Rogers was and what he had sacrificed. Neither of those things can be created quickly. They're built through time, through accumulated viewing, through following a character across multiple films, in multiple situations, and developing the kind of familiarity that starts to resemble actual affection. You know Tony. You know Steve. Not in any real sense, but in the specific way you know a character who has been part of your life for a decade, who you've watched grow up, who you've seen make choices that felt real. The new characters that Phase 4 and 5 introduced are genuinely good characters. Sam Wilson's Captain America is a more nuanced and interesting story than Steve Rogers is in several ways. A man taking up the mantle of a symbol rather than being the symbol's original embodiment, navigating what it means to carry that weight in a different America than the one Steve fought for. Juan Duh Maximoff's arc across WandaVision and Doctor Strange 2 is one of the franchise's more ambitious character trajectories. Shang-Chi is a genuinely compelling new addition, with a satisfying standalone film and a character mythology worth exploring. But none of them have had 11 years. None of them have been tested across multiple tonal registers and multiple genre films in the way that Tony and Steve were. The audience's relationship to them is necessarily shallower, not because they're less interesting characters, but because there hasn't been time to build the depth. The handling of the characters, who remained from the original era, is also worth considering. Thor was still in the franchise through Phase 4, and his arc went from the triumphant reinvention of Ragnarok to the more mixed reception of Love and Thunder. Clint Barton's Hawkeye show was well regarded but relatively low stakes. Bruce Banner's Hulk storyline was largely collapsed into supporting appearances that never fully resolved the arc the character had been on since Avengers: Age of Ultron. Nick Fury, as I mentioned in the context of Secret Invasion, was arguably misused in a lead vehicle that didn't serve the character well. The casting of Robert Downey Jr. as Doctor Doom, a different character, not a resurrection of Tony Stark, is an interesting case study in the franchise's attempt to navigate this problem. Doom is, by comic book reputation, one of Marvel's most significant villains. He has intellectual gravitas, a coherent philosophy, a visual iconography that's immediately recognizable. Downey brings extraordinary charisma and a well-established audience relationship. The combination has genuine potential, but it also illustrates the challenge the franchise faces going forward. The excitement around the announcement was substantially about Downey specifically, about the possibility of seeing this performer in this world again, not just about Doctor Doom as a character. When Doom arrives in Avengers: Doomsday, the audience's engagement with him as a new villain will be partly borrowed from their existing relationship with Downey, which is itself a legacy of the Infinity Saga. That might be exactly the right way to bridge the gap between eras. It does, however, raise the question of how the franchise eventually stands on its own again, without leaning on the credit of the previous decade. Chris Evans recently returned to the MCU as Steve Rogers in Doomsday as well, which was announced around the same time as the Downey news. Again, the audience response was enormous. The pattern here is consistent and interesting. The most powerful marketing tool the MCU currently has is nostalgia for itself. That's not necessarily a terminal condition. Nostalgia can work as a bridge to something new if the new thing is strong enough to capture the audience's independent investment. The question is whether Doomsday and the subsequent Secret Wars can do that, use the original cast's return as an on-ramp for the next generation of characters, the way Civil War used the confrontation between Tony and Steve to establish new dynamics and new characters who would carry the story forward. That would be the ideal outcome. Whether it's achievable is something we'll find out. So what is Marvel actually doing about all of this? The answer, as of 2025 and into 2026, is quite a lot. And the most interesting thing about it is that the diagnosis was publicly acknowledged rather than quietly managed. Feige's admission that the overproduction was the problem was unusual corporate candor. Studios typically don't announce that their strategy caused their own decline. Marvel did something closer to that, and the transparency of it is worth acknowledging. The production plan going forward looks significantly different from the Phase 4 and 5 pace. Feige described the new approach as making less, 2 or 3 films per year at most, some years potentially just 1. On the Disney Plus side, the plan is roughly 1 live-action show per year rather than the 3 to 4 of the peak overproduction period. The contrast with 2022's 8 titles across 12 months couldn't be more stark. There's a specific structural change worth noting too. Industry reports suggested that Vision Quest, a Disney Plus series featuring Paul Bettany returning as Vision, would be the last Disney Plus show to prominently feature major characters from the theatrical films. After Vision Quest, the plan is for films to work as complete standalone experiences, accessible to audiences without prior streaming homework. That's a direct response to the no new fans club problem, and if they hold to it, it addresses one of the core mechanisms that was pushing casual viewers away. The Fantastic Four: First Steps, which released in 2025, was the first real test of the new approach. The film is set in an alternate timeline 1960s, on a version of Earth where the Fantastic Four have been public heroes for 4 years. It's self-contained in a way that most Marvel releases in the preceding several years weren't. You can follow the story, invest in the characters, and feel the emotional weight of what happens without having watched anything beforehand. Early reception was considerably more positive than much of the preceding phase's outputs. Critics noted the accessibility, the clear tonal identity, the sense of a film that knew what it was and committed to it. Whether that represents the beginning of a sustained turn or a single successful film in a still shaky broader context remains to be seen. One film doesn't rebuild a franchise, but it's a data point that the course correction can produce results when the conditions are right. The Fantastic Four also brought the X-Men into play in a way that opened significant narrative possibilities. The X-Men rights had been held by Fox until the Disney acquisition, which meant that one of Marvel's most beloved franchises, mutants, the whole mythology of being feared for what you are, had been unavailable to the MCU for its entire run. Having access to those characters and to the thematic richness they carry gives the post-Endgame phase a well of material that was simply unavailable before. Avengers. Doomsday, scheduled for release in 2026, is the largest test the course correction faces. It brings back Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans alongside the new generation of characters, uses Doctor Doom as the central antagonist, and is meant to function as the Infinity War level event that the Multiverse Saga has been nominally building toward for 6 years. The stakes for it, creatively and commercially, are enormous. Not just as a film, but as a signal about whether the franchise can recapture the cultural moment that made Endgame what it was. The Russo brothers, who directed both Infinity War and Endgame, are directing Doomsday. That's a deliberate choice. Bringing back the directors who helmed the franchise's creative peak is another form of the bridge-building strategy. Their involvement doesn't guarantee anything, but it provides a connection between the era that worked and the era that's trying to work again. What success would look like for Doomsday is worth being specific about, because I think the expectations are sometimes either too high or too low. The too high version. Doomsday needs to be as culturally dominant as Endgame, needs to recapture the full audience that has drifted, needs to restore the MCU to its position as the defining franchise of popular cinema. That's not a realistic standard for a single film, and holding it to that standard would cause us to dismiss genuine progress. The too low version, Doomsday just needs to be good, to make money, to not embarrass the franchise. That's a flaw, not a goal. The realistic version of success is something more specific. Doomsday needs to provide a reason for the audience that has drifted to care again, not just the audience that never left. It needs to function as a genuine re-entry point for people who fell off during Phase 4 and 5, which means it needs to be emotionally accessible without requiring years of homework. It needs to give the existing cast of newer characters their proper introduction to the portion of the audience that hasn't been following them closely, and it needs to set up whatever comes next in a way that feels promising rather than obligatory. The Infinity War comparison is useful here. Infinity War didn't just conclude the storylines that had been building, it recontextualized the entire preceding decade by showing what all of it had been building toward. If Doomsday can do something similar, if it can take the scattered Phase 4 and 5 characters and threads and give them a shape that retroactively makes the preceding years feel more coherent, it would accomplish something genuinely significant. Probably not at Endgame scale, but at a scale that matters. The X-Men angle is one of the things I'm most genuinely curious about going forward, separately from the Doomsday question. The mutant mythology, the experience of being feared and hated for something you were born as, of forming community among people who are treated as threats by the world they want to protect, is thematically rich in ways that none of the Infinity Saga characters have quite touched. It's different enough from what the MCU has done that it could genuinely expand the emotional range of the franchise, rather than simply adding more characters who operate on the same emotional frequencies as the ones already there. Done right, it's one of the most exciting possibilities the franchise has had since Phase 1. What the course correction can't fully solve, at least not quickly, is the trust problem. Audiences who drifted away during Phase 4 and 5 need a reason to come back, and we've fixed the things that went wrong isn't compelling marketing. What is compelling is Tony Stark and Steve Rogers, and a villain played by one of the most charismatic actors working in Hollywood, in a film that looks like it might actually deliver something the franchise has been promising for years. That's a genuine draw. Whether it converts into the kind of cultural moment that the franchise used to generate reliably, the kind where everyone feels like they need to see something opening weekend, or they'll miss the conversation, is the question the next couple of years will answer. Now let's talk about what this story is actually about, underneath the box office charts, and the production decisions, and the specific films. There's a pattern that runs through several of the biggest entertainment franchise collapses of recent decades. The Walking Dead, the Star Wars expanded universe under the early Disney stewardship, the DC extended universe's chaotic early years, and the MCU's difficulties fit that pattern in interesting ways. The pattern is something like this. A creative project succeeds because the people making it are hungry and the conditions require them to be good. Then the project's success creates institutional investment in its continuation, and the institutional investment changes the conditions in ways that make being good harder. The MCU's golden age was built under a specific kind of pressure that success had to eventually remove. In Phase 1, the films had to work. There was no streaming platform absorbing the losses, no franchise guarantee that audiences would show up regardless. Iron Man could have bombed, and the whole experiment would have ended. That pressure, the possibility of failure, is actually one of the creative conditions that tends to produce quality. When the stakes are real, the decisions tend to be more considered. By Phase 5, the MCU was too big to fail in any immediate sense. Films that would have been considered commercial disappointments in most other franchises were acceptable under the Marvel umbrella because the brand still had value, the Disney Plus subscription numbers were being maintained, and the longer-term franchise strategy was being pursued regardless of any individual title's performance. That changes how decisions get made. It creates a safety net that also functions as a creative sedative. The urgency that once drove quality gets replaced by institutional momentum. This isn't unique to Marvel. It's a fairly consistent feature of how large creative enterprises respond to their own success. Disney's approach to the Star Wars franchise after acquiring it in 2012 followed a similar arc. Massive expansion, inconsistent quality, diminishing audience trust, eventual strategic reset. The difference with Marvel is that the decline was steeper and faster, partly because the Infinity Saga had set such a specific and unusually high standard, and partly because the Disney Plus strategy accelerated the production pace beyond what the system could absorb. The corporate dimension of this story also includes the Disney acquisition itself as context. Marvel was acquired by Disney in 2009 for $4 billion. The Infinity Saga turned that investment into something worth many multiples of what Disney paid. By any financial measure, it was one of the most successful acquisitions in corporate history. But the incentive structure that acquisition created, maximizing Marvel's output to generate Disney Plus subscribers and advertising revenue and licensing income, was structurally in tension with the creative conditions that had produced the valuable product in the first place. This is the machine versus art tension that runs through most stories about the collision between creative industries and corporate management. It's not that the people at Disney or Marvel were making cynical decisions or didn't care about quality. The evidence suggests they mostly did care. Feige clearly cared. His acknowledgement of the overproduction problem came from a place of genuine creative frustration. But the incentive structures within which they were operating pushed toward a set of outcomes that were individually defensible and collectively damaging. There's a specific comparison worth making here that I find genuinely clarifying. During the Infinity Saga, individual directors had creative latitude within a coherent overall framework. Feige's overarching plan, the character arcs he was tracking, the payoffs he was building toward, was strong enough to hold the individual contributions together, while flexible enough to allow genuine creative expression. That's why Ragnarok could feel like a Taika Waititi film, and Winter Soldier could feel like a political thriller, while both were unmistakably MCU. When you're producing 8 titles in a year, that framework can't receive the same care it received when you were producing 2 or 3. The gravitational center weakens, things drift. I find this the saddest part of the Phase 4 and 5 story. Not that the individual pieces were bad, but that the connective tissue between them was fraying in ways that were almost invisible at first and then suddenly very visible. The good news, if you want to look for it, is that the conditions that cause the decline are largely correctable. They're not structural features of the franchise's DNA. The core concept, a shared universe, where character choices have lasting consequences, where the accumulation of story creates depth that individual films can't generate alone, is still sound. It worked for 11 years. It can work again. One more thing about the bigger picture. What the MCU's story means for blockbuster cinema more broadly. The MCU didn't just build a franchise, it defined an era. The decade from 2012 to 2022 was substantially shaped by the specific gravity of the Marvel franchise. Other studios chased the connected universe model with varying degrees of success and failure. The DC Extended Universe's early attempts produced a run of critically divisive films before James Gunn's reset found something more coherent. Universal tried a monster universe that lasted approximately 2 films. Sony has been attempting a Spider-Man adjacent universe with decidedly mixed results. The MCU's difficulties in Phase 4 and 5 are therefore not just internally significant, they're the most visible example of the limits of the connected universe model that the industry spent a decade building toward. What Marvel does next will tell the entire industry something about whether this kind of franchise storytelling has a sustainable future beyond the specific conditions that made the Infinity Saga possible. Let me spend some time here just sitting with what the MCU was at its best, because this is ultimately the heart of the story, not the decline itself, but what the decline was actually a decline from. There's a shot in Iron Man 2, not one that usually makes anyone's highlight reel, where Tony Stark is sitting alone in his kitchen, eating donuts inside a giant novelty donut on the roof of a building, and Nick Fury climbs up and sits across from him, and they talk. It's a scene about Tony's self-destructiveness, about the consequences of the arc reactor slowly poisoning him, about the gap between the image he projects and the state he's actually in. It's a quiet scene. No action, no spectacle. Just 2 characters, a somewhat absurd setting, and a conversation that does real work. Marvel made space for scenes like that for years. The conversation between Steve Rogers and Sam Wilson running in circles around the reflecting pool in Winter Soldier. Thor and Rocket talking honestly to each other on a spaceship in Endgame. In Spider-Man: Homecoming, there is a scene with Peter Parker and the Vulture in a damaged plane. Wanda and Vision talking about entropy and grief in WandaVision, in a scene that shouldn't have worked in a superhero franchise and worked completely. These weren't incidental scenes, they were the architecture. The spectacle worked because these scenes worked. The action sequences had weight because you knew who these people were and what they stood to lose. The stakes were real because the relationships were real. Not real in a literal sense, obviously, but real in the way that a story's real when it earns your genuine attention and care. Tony Stark's arc, across 11 films, is one of the great long-form character journeys in popular cinema. That's not faint praise, and it's not hedged by the "for a superhero" film qualification. The journey from the man in the cave building a suit to survive, to the man building better weapons for a government he didn't fully trust, to the man who couldn't stop trying to build a protective system for a world that kept proving it needed one, to the father who had finally found something worth protecting that wasn't an idea or a mission. That arc has genuine depth and genuine honesty. The version of Tony Stark in Endgame is a fundamentally different person from the one in Iron Man, and the difference was earned across a decade of storytelling. Steve Rogers is in some ways the opposite journey, a man who never fundamentally changes because his fundamental character is the point. What changes is the world's relationship to him, and his understanding of what doing the right thing costs in a world that's considerably more morally complicated than World War II. The elevator scene in Winter Soldier, where Steve faces a corridor full of Hydra agents who've been waiting for him to realise he's been betrayed, and he says, "Before we get started, does anyone want to get out?" is one of the most purely satisfying character moments in the franchise, and it works because you know exactly who Steve Rogers is and why he would say that in that moment. And then there's the ensemble. Thor and Tony bickering about who has better toys. Steve and Tony's fundamental tension, the soldier and the futurist, the man from the past and the man planning the future, that runs through every film they share. Natasha being the most competent person in almost any room she enters, while also being the one most aware of the cost of what they all do. Clint being the most human Avenger, the one with a family and a farm and a life outside the mission that he almost loses because of it. Bruce carrying around something he's terrified of and slowly learning to work with it rather than against it. These relationships didn't happen in a single film. They accumulated across years of individual films and team-up films, of moments that built on previous moments, of continuity that rewarded the audience for staying with it. The emotional weight of Endgame's final battle, every portal opening, every character returning, Tony's last line, works because of the entire decade that preceded it. Watching the Infinity Saga from Iron Man through Endgame is still a genuinely remarkable experience, not a flawless one. There are films in the run that are more memorable than others, decisions that didn't fully work, tonal missteps that get ironed out in retrospect. But as a cohesive creative achievement, as a demonstration of what long-form serialized storytelling can do when it's done with care and consistency, it stands up. And here's the thing about the decline. The decline doesn't reach back and take any of that away. It doesn't retroactively diminish what Iron Man was in 2008 or what Endgame was in 2019. Those films exist. They're all still watchable, still available, still capable of doing what they did when they were first seen. The archive is intact. I think about this sometimes when the MCU discourse gets particularly dark. When the conversation is entirely about how far the franchise has fallen and whether it can recover. Because yes, the franchise has had a difficult several years. The specific problems are real and documented and worth understanding, but the thing those problems are a departure from is still there. The foundation is still there. 22 films that built something unprecedented and then delivered on that building in one of the most emotionally satisfying blockbuster conclusions in cinema history. That doesn't go anywhere. Whatever happens with Doomsday and Secret Wars, and the reset and what comes after, the Infinity Saga happened. The shawarma scene happened. Tony Stark said, "I am Iron Man." Steve Rogers went back. Natasha Romanoff told Clint to let go. Those stories are permanent in a way that the franchise's current difficulties are not. Let me spend a few more minutes here, because this section deserves the time. Think about the moment in Civil War where Tony Stark sees the footage of Bucky Barnes killing his parents. Not for the violence of it, for Tony's face. Robert Downey Jr. watching that footage and doing almost nothing externally while everything collapses internally. The moment where Tony tells Steve, "I don't care. He killed my mum," and the line lands not as a plot point, but as a human truth. A brilliant, complicated, powerful man reduced entirely to the grief of a son. That's 11 years of character work, earning a single line. Think about Groot. I am Groot. 3 words, 1 phrase, 1 performance from Vin Diesel that somehow communicated an entire emotional interior across 2 Guardians films and multiple appearances. And then, in Infinity War, as Thanos' snap reduces Groot to dust, his final, "I am Groot," the last 3 words he'll say, the only words he ever says, the specific inflection of them, registered as loss. Actual loss. You can't explain why a CGI tree's death makes people cry, except to say that the franchise had spent years making sure it would. Think about the conversation between Thor and his mother Frigga in Endgame during the time heist. Thor has travelled back to 2013 Asgard, broken down, carrying the weight of everything he's failed to prevent. And he runs into his mother, who was killed in the Dark World, and who he never got to say goodbye to properly. The scene is about 3 minutes long, and it's about a man who has lost everything, getting to tell his mother he's still trying. and Frigga says to him something simple and devastating, that the measure of a person isn't the greatness they achieve, but what they do after loss. Everyone fails at who they're supposed to be, Thor. The measure of a person, of a hero, is how well they succeed at being who they are. It's the best scene in Endgame that isn't the final battle, and it works because of what the audience already knew about Thor's history with his mother, and because of the specific truth it was telling. Think about Hawkeye on Vormir in Endgame. Clint Barton, the Avenger without powers, the one who had always been the most obviously human, the one with the family and the farm, fighting Natasha for the right to die, each of them trying to give the other a chance to live. The specific intimacy of a friendship that had been built in the background of 20 films, rarely centered, never quite dramatized in full, suddenly at the center of the most important scene either character ever had. Natasha, Clint calling out to someone who is already gone, in the quiet after, in the way you call out to people you've lost when you realize the loss is real. These are the things you can't manufacture in 3 years of overproduction. They're made across a decade, in the accumulated weight of small moments, in the care taken with characters who might be considered secondary, in the willingness to let a relationship between a spy and an archer become actually important to people who came to watch Iron Man. That's what the MCU built. And that's what the current franchise is trying to figure out how to build again. From a different starting point, with different characters, under different conditions, but towards something that might eventually carry the same kind of weight. I think it's possible. It won't be the same thing, but it might be its own thing. And the best version of what comes next doesn't need to be a replica of what came before. It just needs to be that honest and that patient. So where does all of this leave us? The MCU is still here, still producing, still capable of surprising people when the conditions are right. It has a genuinely interesting few years ahead of it. The Fantastic Four introduction, the X-Men integration, Avengers, Doomsday, and Secret Wars, and whatever is planned for the decade beyond that. The reset is real. The commitment to making less and making it better is, by Feige's own account, genuine. Whether those commitments hold against the ongoing corporate pressure to maximize output is the open question, and it's one only time can answer. The story of the MCU's decline is also the story of how difficult it is to maintain creative excellence at industrial scale. It's not a story about incompetence or malice, it's a story about institutional pressures and incentive structures, and the specific things that tend to happen when a creative operation becomes too large and too valuable to be allowed to be lean and hungry anymore. Those dynamics are not unique to Marvel. They're present in every large entertainment franchise, every legacy media institution, every creative operation that has been successful enough to accumulate the kind of corporate investment that changes how decisions get made. What the MCU had at its peak was something genuinely rare, a coherent creative vision held by a single person over a very long period, operating within a production structure that allowed that vision to be expressed consistently across many individual films made by many different directors and writers. That coherence is hard to achieve and hard to maintain and easy to lose. They lost it for a while. They're trying to rebuild it. Whether you feel hopeful or skeptical about that probably depends a lot on how much the decline cost you personally, in terms of the specific disappointments you sat through and the specific investments you made that weren't honoured. Those feelings are fair. The franchise did ask for people's trust and time and enthusiasm, and it didn't always honour what was given. I find myself somewhere in the territory of cautious interest, if I'm honest. I think Doomsday has real potential. I think the reduced output plan makes sense and addresses the right problem. I think bringing the original cast back as a bridge, rather than a crutch, if it's done well, could actually work to hand the franchise to its next generation in a way that the post-Endgame period never quite managed. And I think the X-Men integration opens up story possibilities that genuinely haven't been available to this universe before. But I've also been here long enough to know that potential and execution are different things, and that making less has to hold against the next streaming strategy, the next earnings call, the next mandate from above. The conditions that caused the decline haven't disappeared from the institutional environment. They've been partially corrected. Whether that partial correction is sufficient to sustain quality over the next decade, rather than producing a few years of improved films before the same pressures reassert themselves? That's the real question. The shawarma scene still makes me smile. Whatever else happened, that's where it started, with 6 people eating in silence after saving the world, and a whole theatre laughing because something they hadn't known they needed had just arrived. That feeling was real once. I think there are people working very hard to find it again. And honestly, the story of trying to find it again is almost as interesting as the story of having it the first time. There's something in the specific challenge the MCU faces now that I find genuinely worth following. Not just as a franchise story, but as a question about how creative ambition survives its own success, whether the people who built something extraordinary under conditions of uncertainty can rebuild something worth caring about under conditions of institutional weight. The hunger was real in 2008. Robert Downey Jr. in that cave, building something to survive, with everything to prove. Kevin Feige pitching a connected universe to a studio that wasn't entirely sure it would work, with a lineup of characters most people had never heard of, betting that audiences would follow if the stories were told well enough. That bet paid off beyond anything anyone could have reasonably predicted. Whether the next version of the bet pays off, whether Doomsday lands the way Infinity War landed, whether the new generation builds the kind of attachment the original cast had, whether the reduced production pace holds against the next set of corporate pressures, all of that is still ahead of us. The story isn't finished. That's either the frustrating part or the interesting part,